The day I got my first laptop was one of the most exciting days in my life. Then, just a few days later, when I opened a new computer magazine and saw a much better laptop for the same price, that feeling of excitement turned to disappointment, and it has remained that way ever since. Every time I looked at that laptop, every time I loaded it up, and every time a game slowed down slightly more than I was happy with on it, I felt deep regret that I hadn't waited just a few days more and got that better one instead. It's not like that new laptop made mine worse, yet somehow that new laptop existing did make mine feel worse. And it felt so unjust that I was seemingly punished despite all that patience I had and research I had done. And even now, long after both of those laptops would have been rendered obsolete, and after many laptop purchases of mine later, I still feel like I'm living in a darker timeline because of that ill-fated laptop purchase I made 20 years ago. Such was the rapid state of progress back then. These days, it's almost the opposite. People look back fondly at older components and wish they had got them before the prices went crazy amid the crypto boom and all that. So the moral of this story is, whatever you do, it will be wrong with hindsight. Suck it. But perhaps a more profound way of looking at this would be that every component can be seen with two perspectives: how it looks at release and how it looks afterwards. Components like Intel's i5-2500K and the GeForce 1080 Ti weren't bad cards, even at release, but their legendary legacy was only forged thanks to what came after, namely in the form of the following generations of components being disappointing in some way. In Intel's case, things barely got any faster for about 5 years after the 2500K's release. So with hindsight, it was an excellent processor at release that only became better with time, which bucked the usual trend of rapid progress and obsolescence that we had been used to up to that point. And with the GeForce 1080 Ti, I remember at release it seemed just like the 980 Ti and the Titan cards before that. They were flagship cards at flagship prices, and it seemed to me like the 1080 Ti would just be trumped by a cheaper card the following generation. However, with AMD taking so many years to catch up, and with the move over to RTX cards and then the pricing hikes that followed, the 1080 Ti achieved the unthinkable. It transformed a costly flagship card into something that, with hindsight, was excellent value for money. Even more so than the budget cards at the time. It seemed as though getting the 1080 Ti rather than the 1080 or the 1060 or even the Radeon 480 served almost like a better investment that would pay off for many years to come. The whole thing's broken, isn't it? At release day you can only purchase stuff knowing what came before, yet these components will only be judged against what comes after them. For release day is just a day, but what follows is forever. And the thoughts of the most knowledgeable people today will be trumped by morons tomorrow that are blessed with the power of hindsight. So I've talked about components aging like fine wine, but the opposite can also happen. Look at AMD's Ryzen, perhaps the greatest victim of progress in recent memory. In 2017, at its release, those first generation Ryzen components were the best thing to have happened to the processor market in half a decade. Ryzen was a godsend. It doubled core counts, halved prices. Imagine if this happened to the graphics card market today. That was what Ryzen did for processors back then. And despite what people might think today, the single core performance was decent. It was spectacular and marked a return to form for AMD after it seemed like, for so long, they would never be able to catch up with their rivals again. However, despite being the best thing ever, because things have only got better since, the first generation of Ryzen is not remembered so fondly today. Because every new generation of Ryzen has been a big improvement over the one that came before, and even Intel has kicked into gear again and decided to make decent strides. So with the damn power of hindsight, that first generation of Ryzen looks bad. Comparatively slow cores, it came with a new motherboard standard with teething issues, and it's only been saved by the legendary upgradability of the AM4 platform that it's on. In other words, first gen Ryzen is only good now because you can replace it with something better. But I hate it when I see people criticizing processors like the Ryzen 1600 or 1700X for those reasons, because it is only showing one side of the story, and it seems so cruel to judge all those people who bought it or who spoke highly of it at the time simply because of what came after. Because I still remember that other perspective and how it marked the end of the driest spell in processor history. And as slow as you might claim them to be, first gen Ryzen is still a perfectly capable processor to this day. I can think of many examples like this over the decades, and I suppose this gives me a different perspective on the current situation in the processor and graphics card market. Because to many newcomers, how things are right now might be all you know them as ever being, and how you might think it will be forevermore. But I've been around for long enough to see things differently, for I've known the impossible to happen, and for the status quo to quickly become the status no. For things today are priced on what came before, and not on how they'll fare in future storms. And it's those future unknowns that will shape the future of hardware progress, and perhaps more importantly, how all existing components will be judged with hindsight. And it's this that made Child Philip literally cry because his laptop had a Celeron, when a few days later he could have got something decent instead.